Howdy folks, welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to be learning how to sanitize a multi-email address input. Now that may not sound like something that's terribly exciting, but once you see it I think you'll understand it. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So what I've been working on the past few days is the invitation workflow inside of Command, the upcoming SaaS product from Clever Beagle. And as part of that process, one of the things you'll be able to do as the administrator of a product that you're working on is invite team members. So as we can see here, when this modal opens up, so let's go back here. So if I say invite people, by default I have the option to just add one person at a time or invite one person at a time. But on the bottom of the modal here we have an option to say add multiple at once. And so what I want to show you is how I implemented this multi-input. So we can see here if I say test at test.com, and then let's say another at test.com, and then I go ahead and add these to the list, we can see that when I click that button, add these to the list at the bottom, they're automatically populated back on this entire list. And so I want to walk you through how I did that. So the idea here, the problem that we need to solve with a feature like this is a user could literally type in whatever they want. And so the thing that we need to do is sanitize that input. So we need to actually check, did they do what we told them to do? Because while it's nice to think that everybody's going to be like a developer and say, oh yeah, comma separated list, testing 1, 2, 3, you might get weird input like this, either because somebody doesn't know what they're doing or because they're just messing with you. But regardless, your system should be designed to handle this. So right now, if I do this, so I've got one legitimate email in here, and I do have a bunch of comma separated values, but we'll notice that the other 3 are not email addresses. So if I click add these to the list, we'll notice that those are automatically sanitized out. So anything that doesn't look like an email address is just scooped out. And so if I go back, and now I'm just going to type a bunch of gibberish into the box. If I do this, we get an error. So it's saying something doesn't look right. Can you double check your list is comma separated values and contains email addresses? So what I want to do is jump over to the code and look at how this works. So if we go into this component, so this component is this modal right here. And I have this function called handle add multiple to list. And if we look, this is called as soon as somebody pushes this button at the bottom of the modal. So literally we just say, okay, when you click that, we'll grab the contents of this box and we'll try and add it to the list. So if we look at that function, there's a few different things going on in here. So the first is we need to actually get a list of addresses. Because remember, when we're inside of this box, we don't know that this is a list. We're assuming that it's a list, but for all intents and purposes at the code level, this is a string. So we don't know what this is. And so in order to convert that, assuming that the user followed our instructions of saying enter a comma separated list, we can take the value of the input, and here I'm using a React ref called this.multiple addresses. So if we go down and look at that, the way I've done this is I'm using the form.textArea component infer, which is the CSS framework that I'm building alongside of Command, and that's going to come out probably a month or 2 after Command comes out. And so what I'm doing is I'm using the input ref prop, which is assigning a ref back to this component, or the text area rendered by this component. And so what that means is it's giving me a pointer to this component as it's rendered on screen in the browser once React does the actual rendering process. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, this argument right here, multiple addresses, is referring to the rendered text area on screen. So this function is automatically called by React at render time. So when all of this stuff renders, React is going to eventually hit this component. It's going to say, oh, it has a ref? Okay, let me go ahead and give you access to the rendered DOM node as an argument to this function, whatever function you define. So here, multiple addresses is literally referring to this text area input here. And so what I'm saying in the context of this modal component is I want this.multiple addresses to be set equal to that DOM node instance. And so the long story short of all of that is that that's giving me direct access to that input or that element inside of the entire component instance. And so back up in our function, we go back up to handle add multiple to list, what we can see is we've got this dot multiple addresses, which is our input, and remember this is the DOM node that's actually rendered on screen. So this isn't the virtual DOM instance of it or anything like that. This is the actual DOM node. So what that means is we have access to all of the native values or properties that are present on a DOM node in the UI. So in this case, the value property. So I'm saying give me that input's value, and then I'm saying split it at every comma. Meaning, so if we type this out, say we get a string back like test at test.com, comma, blah at test.com. So what's happening is this string is represented by this part right here. So we'll assume that this is what was typed in the box. So that's what we get back with this, but then split is going to say, okay, at every comma in that string, I'm going to now go in and literally split the string at that point, and I'm going to split it into an array. So the end result of this is going to be test at test.com, and then this is where this gets interesting. We'll see how I handle this. And then we get this space blah at test.com. So quite literally, the string is just being chopped at that point. So that's kind of saying this comma is a breakpoint that we want to generate our array from. So we're saying, okay, when you get to that breakpoint, stop, give us that value, and then go on to whatever the next value is, if it exists. And so the end result is we get this array with two strings in it. And we'll notice the first one is what we'd expect. It's just the email address. But the second one has a space in front of it. And the reason it has a space in front of it is because our string has a space. So if our user didn't put a space, which is possible, then we would get this back. But we have to kind of assume that like, okay, somebody might leave spaces in there and they might do something really crazy like that. So what we're going to do, and let me go ahead and see if I can comment that. Yeah, so we'll leave that in scope so we can see it. So what I'm going to do with that list of addresses, we'll notice, is on the next line, I'm mapping over that list of addresses. And again, I can map because split, no matter what, is going to return me an array. It's either going to give me an array with one value in it, or it's going to give me an array with several if there are multiple commas in the string. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, map over that list, and I know that I expect each value in that list to be one string representing an email address. So I say the argument to my map function is email address. And then the thing that may not make a ton of sense here is that from that map function, I'm saying return an object for each of those email address strings. And that object is going to have an underscore ID property, and it's going to have the email address. So let's focus on the email address first. So what this is saying is, okay, on that object, assign email address to itself, but trim it. And so what this is doing, if we go back here and assume that there was a space in between the strings, so if it looked like this. So if we got a value like this, what trim is going to do is it's going to remove those blank spaces for us. So it doesn't matter how many there are, it's literally just going to trim off all of the blank spaces. And so what this gets us is a nice formula, or uniform, that's the word I'm looking for, uniform list of email addresses that are all strings and just the email address and nothing else. All right? So that's one. Now, the part that doesn't probably make any sense is this ID. So this is something that I'm having to do in order to think ahead about how this UI works. So if we go back to the browser real quick, I'm going to close this out, and we'll notice that once an invitation, so that's what this is doing, you're inviting users. So once an invitation has been added, what you'll notice is I have a list and I can delete those invitations. And so those invitations, or actually, no, ignore me, I'm pointing to the wrong thing. It's back here. So once you've added multiple, let's do this so I don't confuse the heck out of myself. So we're going to say, we'll say Ryan at test.com. And we'll say add these to the list. So this list right here, and let's add another one so we can see the actual list. So what this is saying is, okay, we have multiple lists, or list items, each one representing an email address that we want to invite. And so I've got X's next to each one. Now, if I click on Ryan at test.com, I don't want to delete the second one. I want to delete the one that I clicked on. And so back here in the code, this underscore ID value is helping me to figure out which one did I click on. And we're not going to look at that too much, but just know that because that exists, that allows me to go in and when I click the delete button on one of those email addresses, I can target that specific one and remove it, or in this case, filter it out of the existing email addresses array on state that's showing up right here. So if I add each of these, each of these now is being given a unique ID. So if I say removes, we'll say blah, 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 and then we'll leave one blank. So we'll notice if I say this 2351, if I delete that, we'll notice that all of the others stay intact. And that's because I had that unique ID and I'm able to say that one as opposed to just popping off a random item from the array, which wouldn't be good. So back to our sanitization code, what we're saying here is, okay, we've got our comma separated string being converted to an array. Now we're mapping over that and we're saying, okay, go ahead and trim the email address and add everything as an object, so that should be good. And we'll notice that now we get back an array called addresses to add. So this is where the sanitization comes in. So what I'm doing right here on the next line is I'm saying these are the valid addresses. And you'll notice that I'm assigning that argument, valid addresses, or that variable, valid addresses, to this.getValidAddresses. And I'm passing in addresses to add. So I'm passing in the array that comes back from addresses.map. So I'm saying get valid addresses. And if we go and hunt down that function, notice that's pretty simple. So what I'm doing is I'm saying that I want to take in whatever array I'm passed. So in this case, this is the addresses that we've converted to objects. So we've got the ID and the email address with all of the blank space trimmed off. So I'm saying, okay, given that array, I want to filter out any email address, or I want to, this is where this filter method gets a little confusing. So the end goal is to say filter out any email address in this array that isn't a valid email address or isn't an actual email address. And so what I'm doing with this is I'm saying address.filterout, and this is why this is confusing. The filter method is essentially saying whatever returns true in the function body of the filter method, keep that. So it's kind of backwards. It's saying, we're not saying filter these things out if they pass a truthy test. We're saying keep them if they pass a truthy test and leave anything out that gives a falsy or false equivalent. Take that out. Get that out of the array. And that takes a second to wrap your head around. So that's what this is doing. We're saying filter or loop over this list, and as you do, and you'll notice I'm using ES6 destructuring here. So I'm saying pluck out the email address property of the object. And I can use destructuring because I know that this addresses array is going to contain objects. So I can say pluck off just the email address property, and then I'm passing this to a function called validator.isEmail. And this is coming from a package that's really, really handy for stuff like this called conveniently validator. And it's a catch-all library with a bunch of just validators. So is this a URL? Is this a credit card number? I think that's in there. Or is this an email? It's got a bunch of stuff. So if you're ever looking for one-off validations, that's the library to check out. And the one that I'm using here, obviously, is validator.isEmail. So for each email address that's in that array that I pass, and again, this could be 1 or this could be 500. It doesn't really matter. It's just whatever the user has put into this list. I'm saying I only want to keep the email address, or I only want to keep that value if its email address property is actually an email address. So if it's not, I just want to go get out. So if we go back down to where we're using this, so handle add multiple to list is calling to this get valid addresses. So whatever I get back from this, I can guarantee is going to be a list of actual email addresses that I can actually send email to, or at least in principle, their format looks like an email address. Whether they're actual email addresses, that's a whole other bag of chips. So once we have that list of valid addresses, then what I'm doing is I'm checking. So I'm saying, did we actually get back an array of valid addresses with a length? So what I mean by that is I could say, and let's clear this out so we don't get too confused. So I can say blah, and then blah. So keep in mind that when I click add multiple, this sanitization is happening at that time, but it's also being added to this list. So what I can get away with, or try to get away with, is adding a bunch of gibberish back here and then getting it caught. So what's happening is I'm running get valid addresses again in another view. But right here what I'm saying is only add these addresses back to state. And let's clear this out again and make sure this is clear, both for you and for me. So let's go to add multiple at once, and we're going to say test at test.com, and then we'll say bagels. I don't know why I'm thinking about bagels, but we got bagels. And then we'll say magic at test.com. So if I say add these to the list, what we'd expect is that, okay, of this list, only 2 are valid. The third one, bagels, or the second one, technically, is nothing. It's just a string. So if I say add these to the list, we can see that what happened is this code right here. So we ran it through here, and we only got back 2 addresses. So we got back test at test.com and magic at test.com. And then because that passes this check, it's saying, okay, there's 2 addresses here. Then what I'm doing is I'm setting those email addresses back onto state. And we can see here I've got, and again, make sure this is clear, this state is in this entire modal. So this whole modal that we're looking at here contains both this list as well as the multiple input. So I'm just using another state value. What's it called? It is called the invitation method. So invitation method, if it's 1 by 1, we see this list UI. And if it's, what do I call it, multiple, add multiple. So if it's add multiple, I flip over to this multi-input. And so what's going on back in our handle add multiple function is I'm saying, okay, if we have a list of valid addresses, then we want to update the email addresses value on state. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the function method for set state. So if you are a little more used to the traditional method, you'll just say set state with some object. So we might say email addresses and then assign it some value. The function value, what that does is and this is really neat, it gives you the current value of email addresses on state so that you can do something to it, like you can manipulate it or change it in some way. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking in whatever the existing value is on state, because there may have been 5 or 10 or 100 different addresses already added through the 1 by 1 method, and now I'm saying, okay, take that existing list and spread it out onto this new array. So I'm creating a brand new array right here, and I'm saying, okay, take whatever exists, unpack it into this new array, and then also unpack that list of valid addresses that we just got. So that could be 0 or it could be 50. It doesn't matter. It's just whatever we got back. Actually, it couldn't be 0. It's got to be 1 or more. So 1 or however many. So now what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, go ahead and give me back that array, but then I want to filter out one more time. I want to make sure that every address in that array is trimmed. So I want to make sure that we don't keep any addresses that are just blank spaces. And that could happen because we're dealing with this multi-input string. Somebody could just sit and do something like that. So we're just making sure that, okay, no matter what, this list is trimmed, all these email addresses are good. And so once we do that, this is kind of confusing if you're not used to the syntax. So what this is doing is it's saying create the array, filter it, and then all of that at the same time is being passed to our set state call. So the way that this function method works is it's saying here's the current value, and then as the response to that function, set state is expecting me to return the new state value that I'm trying to set. So effectively what I'm doing here is I'm saying set email addresses and invitation method on state to these values. So in this case we have our sanitized list of email addresses, and we're going to go back to the 1 by 1 view. And to make sure that's clear, if I go back over to add multiple, so right now I'm in the add multiple state of this modal. So I'm going to say, I don't know why that popped in, but with the Koopa at mario.com, and then we'll say pizza at lunch.com, and we'll say 1 at more.com. So if we pay attention, all 3 of these are going to get sanitized and checked to make sure they look like an email address, and then they're going to be put back on state, and we're going to switch the invitation method, which again is the state or the UI of the modal, back to 1 by 1. So if I come back in here and I say add these to the list, everybody shows up on the list, and we go back to the UI. And so that's it. And we'll notice, just as another touch, if I add a bunch of stuff that isn't a list of valid addresses, so if we go to add multiple, and I'll just say, some gibberish, and then I try to add these to the list, we get this alert, so something doesn't look right, and we'll notice that that's the else block of if valid addresses.length is greater than 0. So what that means is if there were no valid addresses or no valid emails, then we want to throw an alert and say, hey, easy on the gas, you need to check this out. But that's it. So hopefully that was helpful. This is the type of UI that comes up every now and then, and it's really boring. I've had to really force myself to get this done. And you may be looking at this and you may be like, wait, where'd you get that from? Did you come up with that? And it's like, not entirely. So I'm a big fan of the quote, good artist copy, great artist steal. So I've taken this completely from the Slack admin. So I did my own styling and stuff like that on this, but the basic mechanics of it I've taken from Slack, because that's one of those things that, you know what, they've got a ton of users using their product. This pattern has obviously been proven, otherwise they wouldn't keep it. And so it's something where I don't have to waste the brain cycles trying to figure out, oh, how would I do this? I can just say, you know what, their method works, let me adapt it for my own UI and be done with it. So a little nugget to take with you if you don't already do that. And so with that is going to do it for this week's Feature Friday. That was a quick one, but it was something that I was looking at, I was like, man, this has got a lot of nice little details in it, so I figured I'd teach you about it. And so as always, make sure that if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button down below, and then just to the side of it, tap the bell if you want to get notifications as soon as these are published, because that really helps me out to know that you guys are interested in this, and I'm not just talking into the abyss of the internet. So that's going to do it for me, folks. Thanks again for watching, and signing off for the HMS Beagle. I'll see you next week. Howdy. Thanks for watching another episode of Feature Friday. If you want to get more content like this, head over to cleverbeagle.com/subscribe and pop in your email address to get notifications in your inbox as soon as I publish stuff like this. And I'm going to put some videos up on the screen and also give you access to the subscribe link. And while that's going, I'm going to read some dad jokes to you. So, did you hear about the restaurant on the moon? It's got great food, but no atmosphere. What do you call a fake noodle? It's an impasta. How many apples grow on a tree? All of them. Want to hear a joke about paper? Never mind, it's terrible. I just watched a program about beavers. It was the best damn program I've ever seen. That was good. Why did the coffee file a police report? Got mugged. How does a penguin build its house? It glues it together.